Okay, so let's talk a little bit about spirituality and its effect on health. Um, so this has been studied for quite a long time. Decades, 50, 60, 70 years of research indicates that prayer and religious activity seems to be very beneficial to your health, despite what some authors like to claim. The fact is that, again, like I said, this has been studied for a very long time. Um, in this country and other countries as well. It doesn't seem to matter what denomination someone is. It's just regular religious activity is protective against cardiovascular disease, cancer. It can help somebody recover from cardiovascular disease and cancer. Again, it's not just prayer in and of itself. It's a combination of a healthy lifestyle. But when you combine religion and spiritual practices, it enhances your health even more. So sometimes I refer to it as intrinsic religiousness. So it's the level of faith in your life, in your everyday life, seems to have a pretty significant impact on health. A lot of positive correlations between regular prayer and positive health outcomes. Um, this third point here, it says with more so with petition prayer, or excuse me, meditative forms rather than petition or repetition prayers. Repetition prayers actually have been shown to have some benefit. We'll talk about those. A person's attitude about religion, spirituality is a major predictor. So, at this point, if we were in a classroom, I would have a conversation about, what type of attitude would have a negative impact on health, and usually somebody comes up with it. If you're of the belief or someone's of the belief, my religion's right, everyone else is wrong, everyone else is going to burn in hell, and especially when you take action against that, you start willing to take physical violence to someone that does not believe in the same thing as you. That's unfortunately what happens. Occasionally, most people don't go that. That's a very small percentage of the population that actually would do something like that. As far as science and spirituality, there seems to be a debate between the two, and the debate is kind of silly. The fact is, like I said before, most people are somewhere in between. They're not extreme on one extreme end of atheism, and they're not on the other extreme end where they're deny any science at all. So, we talked about Cartesian science and the separation of the mind and the body. So typically, traditionally in science, they don't really talk about spiritual practices. When they do, it's referred to as parapsychology. If you've ever seen the movie Ghostbusters, and I think they're making another one actually, I'm pretty excited about it. It's the kind of movies that I watch. Those guys in the Ghostbusters, those guys were parapsychologists. So it typically refers to the occult or ghosts, things like that. But number one at the top of the list when you're talking about parapsychology is the belief in God, which is 90% of the world's population, probably more than that, probably more like 95%. There was always non-spiritual aspects to medicine. They always needed to know how to, um, treat a snake bite or whatever it might be. But healing was usually performed as part of a spiritual or religious ceremony. If you look at all the different cultures throughout the world, um, the term shamanism or shamanism depends how you choose to pronounce it. It's kind of a generalized term now. This was originally a term that they used in Siberia for the native people of Siberia, and it described their religious leader. When anthropologists started studying other cultures throughout the rest of the world, they found that every culture has a very unique way about it, but there are core components of every culture's religious experience, and those core components um, are kind of they find these in every culture in every part of the world. These core components of the different religions. So while all the religions have their own unique beliefs and their own unique practices, there are core beliefs in every religious system throughout the world. Not just religion, but mythology as well. So and they kind of just use shamanism as like a general term. So generally, when you think about shamanism, you think about the Native American people or the Australian Aboriginal people, the people in Tibet and India, China, Africa, with the voodoo traditions. Um, uh, so I have Native Americans. So there's different cultures in Native American, North American, the Central American area. There's writers that talked about their shamanist practices, and I cannot remember the guy's name now. Carlos Castaneda. Carlos Castaneda. I don't know how to spell that last name, but he wrote a lot about like Mexican and Central American shamanistic practices. That's pretty interesting. And all the stuff. It doesn't really matter if you're looking at China, India, Tibet. Again, they all have their unique practices, but they're all based on kind of underlying principles. And these are usually what you find, not usually, pretty much in every culture, every culture's religion. So first of all, they have rituals, regular rituals. It could be, think about Christian religion. They go to mass. They're supposed to go once a week. Some people go once a week. Some people go every day. It could be more of a, think about the Aboriginal people in Australia. When they have the rituals, the dance rituals, and things like that. Obviously, prayer and meditation are a big part of religion and spirituality. Music and dancing are almost always involved. Sometimes it's just music. But even I grew up Catholic. I'm not really practicing anything anymore. But I tend to use Christian or Catholic examples, and I apologize if anybody's offended by that, but it's just what I'm familiar with. But understanding that every religion has those same core components. And they don't really dance that much in the Catholic practice, but they are constantly getting up and sitting down and kneeling. Like that movement probably would replace the dancing, I guess, in Catholicism. Inebriation, so some form of altered state of consciousness, whether it's from the prayer and the meditation, or in some cases they'll use intoxicants, alcohol or cannabis. Native Americans use a plant called peyote. I think it's a cactus that induces hallucinations. So it depends on what culture. Some of them do use drugs or alcohol. Some of them will just use prayer and meditation. Different strokes for different folks, I guess. So whatever. But achieving altered states of consciousness is a very natural human inclination. People have been using alcohol and cannabis recreationally for probably the beginning of time, at least the beginning of recorded history, anyway. So the belief in miracles. If it's your own religion, you tend to refer to it as a miracle. If it's somebody else's religion, you tend to use the term magic. But it's essentially the same idea. Healing with energy is also a universal concept. Whether it's a priest laying hands on and saying a prayer, when they do the baptism, things like that, or flat out something like Qigong, where they do energy exercises like Tai Chi, and then the Qigong master, we'll talk about this when we talk about Chinese medicine, the Qigong master actually projects energy from his hands and it goes into the patient. And of course you see that in Christian healing as well. The last three things I have here: astral projection, lucid dreaming. I'm not really the person to talk about those kind of things. I never experienced them myself. I think everybody has had episodes of lucid dreaming. That's where you kind of wake up in your dream. But some people can actually control it. But feel free to look more into those. I know it's a big part of the Native American religions. The Tibetan Buddhists have something for it as well. They call it dream yoga. So you might want to Google that term, dream yoga. And it's the same thing as lucid dreaming, or it's very similar anyway. Again, going back to energy, we're going to talk about energy more when we talk about Chinese medicine and Indian medicine, because this is what they're based on. But every culture that has ever existed has a name for this energy. And it's, in the United States, we call it bioenergy. And, they like to say in the United States, because we're in Western medicine, because it's based on Cartesian principles, that they don't like this, obviously, because it's, this represents spirituality, and they don't like mixing spirituality in with science. But, to their own demise, because they're missing out on a very effective form of medicine. In some cases, acupuncture has been, we'll talk about some of the research, but there's pretty steady research demonstrating that it works. So, I would recommend that you do something, some type of energetic exercise, whether it's yoga or Tai Chi, something that you feel comfortable with. And again, using that energy is a perennial tradition, perennial meaning that it's always been around. And it survives today in the form of acupuncture, Reiki. We'll talk about Reiki a little bit more, yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, some form of Christian healing, and countless others. And it's based on this idea of the perennial philosophy. Again, perennial, it's something that continually comes back time and time again. So it's the idea that there's one energy or spirit or soul, whatever you want to call it, that makes up the universe. So everything and everyone is a manifestation of that one energy. And sometimes they refer to it as a divine ground to all that is. So there's a spark of divinity within each one of us, and not just with each one of us, but in everything around us. So this idea is a central idea in every one of the major religions, and it's the basis for all forms of mythology, is this one idea that God is within, essentially. And it's when they refer to the mystical experience, what traditionally what they, or pretty much what they're talking about, or people that experience that, what they claim is that what they feel is that interconnectedness of the universe, that everything is connected together, that like everything in the universe is one. So there's a guy named Aldous Huxley. He was around. He was a very interesting guy. He was a writer, fiction writer, philosopher, a poet. And William Blake, who was preceded him, he had a quote: "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." Pardon me. And then Huxley borrowed that and wrote the book *The Doors of Perception*, which it's kind of an interesting book. I did try to read it, and it was way over my head. Because he was on mescaline when he wrote it, and it's basically about mescaline, his experience on mescaline. Mescaline, I think it comes from a mushroom or something, and it's a hallucinogen, and that's basically what he's talking about. So it's kind of hard to understand somebody that's writing something on mescaline. But some of the other books are pretty interesting. He wrote the book *The Perennial Philosophy* and *The Divine Within*, which is just a series of essays, and it's just about religious explanations of religious theology that talks about divinity living within. And is probably best known for his fiction, including the book *Brave New World*. So the 4 main points is that in the perennial philosophy, there's something bigger than us. We are part of something bigger. And sometimes they refer to it as we are like cells in a body. We are all together part of a much bigger something, whatever it is. Currently, we're separated from it, or we appear to be separated from it. It depends on what type of religion you're talking about. Typically, when you think of from Western religions, they like to say that we're kind of separated. We're separated from God temporarily, or we appear to be separated from it. Sometimes that's more like an Eastern kind of thought. Through a variety of religious or spiritual practices, you can become reunited with that energy again, whatever you want to talk about, whatever you want to call it, God or Buddha or whatever it is. And then once that separation is over, once you become reunited with that energy, that spirit, you have a much richer, fuller life. So there are 4 doctrines under this. So the first one is that the world of, and we kind of already talked about this, but the physical world that we live in, and the individualized consciousness, it's all a manifestation of one energy, a divine ground. Second, we're capable not only of experiencing or knowing about this, but we can also experience it. And again, this is what they refer to as the mystical experience, unification with God. Again, that's what we refer to in Christian terms. A Buddhist term would have, Buddhist theology has the same idea. Hinduism as well. Third, man possesses a double nature, an ego, so your personalized consciousness, and then an eternal self. And if you look at that picture to the left, sometimes this is how it's drawn. So your personality, whatever your personality is, my personality is Matthew Sobel. That is my ego. The true self, my whole entire personality is actually much bigger than that simple, that personality of Matt Sobel. And as you go further down these paths of spiritual practices, the ego starts to kind of become, I don't want to say diminished, but maybe less important, and that the true self, who you really are, kind of becomes a little bit more into your personality. It's kind of hard to explain, but feel free to read a little bit more about this. If you just read about this kind of stuff, or just Google ego and higher self, somebody could give you a little bit, probably more in-depth explanation of it. And then fourth, man's life on earth has only one end and purpose: to identify himself with his eternal self, and become knowledgeable of God or Buddha or whatever you want to call it, Allah, whatever your particular religion teaches. Houston Smith is another writer, kind of an interesting guy, very much based in Christian theology, but very much open to every form of religion and mythology. And he uses the term primordial tradition because perennial refers to that a belief system that it is in every time period. And he just kind of expands on this because not only is it in every time period, but it's in every place in the world, which is kind of cool. So, and then there's another guy, Ken Wilber. He writes about this kind of stuff, and you can kind of feel free. It's just his own take on this kind of thing. So, again, in Christian theology, it's the idea that God lives in everyone and everything. And even down at St. Joe's, I mentioned that I teach at St. Joe's because it's a Catholic school. I hear this idea quite a bit. I think it's because they're Jesuits, and that might be Jesuit is a specific type of priest, and that might be a Jesuit thing. I'm not exactly sure. Again, a common statement among Christian healers is that it's not me, but Jesus working through me. So there's still a lot of meditative or prayer techniques to help practitioners get in touch with, the inner divinity or inner God. So if you happen to be interested in Christian or in any type of religion, just kind of look into this, and you'll find it within your own religion. There's these kind of core ideas, and then of course using energy has always been used, and everyone is capable of using this. Again, in Western science, they're not real big open to this yet because of this Cartesian split that we're in right now. They call it in the philosophy of science. I actually took a class as an undergraduate in it. They talk about the demarcation problem. In other words, what is the mark of a science? And physics and biology, those are all obviously real sciences, but psychology not so much. Maybe philosophy certainly not. And this, according to strict Cartesian philosophy, this is not science, but it is science. It's just a different approach to it. So these are some of the different types of prayers. Supplication, one-sided, directed petitions. Dear God, help me win the lottery today. That kind of stuff probably doesn't have a whole lot of health benefits, I should say, especially when they're real quick. Rote prayers like the Rosary. Praying the Rosary can be beneficial, very beneficial, especially if you mix in. If you remember the breathing techniques that we used, or that we looked at, Andrew Weil looked at it, the 4-7-8 breath. You can combine that with the Rosary if you do Catholic prayer, and there's a pretty interesting way to combine the two. So it's a 30-minute meditation with deep breathing exercises, and then some of these other prayers you can take a look for. Gratefulness. Anytime you're just saying thank you or grateful for what you have, or Thanksgiving, that's very beneficial to your health. So definitely want to check those out. Andy Newberg, again, down at University of Pennsylvania. He's down at Jefferson University, or Thomas Jefferson University Hospital Center for Integrative Medicine. He's the research director there. He's a neurologist, and he's been doing brain scans on Buddhist monks and Catholic nuns and priests and people who speak in tongues, like all kinds of really cool, a very diverse group of spiritual practitioners, and just to find out what's going on in their brains. And he got a lot of research funding for to Alzheimer's prevention, and he's developed meditative practices that are secular. So he takes these practices that have been used in religious techniques for thousands of years, and he develops a non-religious or non-spiritual secular method of practicing these. And again, meditation is mental exercise, and he uses these to help people with that have had strokes and other issues. So if I can, I'll post the instructions. It's kind of hard. It's in a big book that he wrote, so it's kind of hard to synthesize everything into one page. But any type of meditation practice that we talked about obviously is very healthy. He's the one that says 12 minutes of meditation a day. That's what we should try and shoot for. Again, there's been a ton of epidemiological evidence that people that engage in regular religious or spiritual activity have lower rates of cardiovascular disease, lower rates of cancer. Now that's compared to all other things being equal. You know, somebody from the Bible Belt area of the United States. It's like the southern, kind of middle southern part of the United States. Um, you know, they have lower rates of cardiovascular disease compared to people that eat the same diet. So, you know, that's also barbecue land as well. So there's going to be a lot of cardiovascular disease in there anyway. But, you know, the more religious people have lower rates of cardiovascular disease, despite the fact that they eat the same diet. So it's just kind of interesting. Nobody really knows exactly why it happens. They just know that it does, that it is. There's been some randomized controlled clinical trials. They don't really seem to be. This is when you have a group of people praying for somebody that's sick, and the person, and you know, there's always the placebo effect. You know, if somebody knows that a group of people are praying for them, they're probably going to get better, or it might help. But this was what like a real legitimate controlled study, and they found that there probably isn't much to it. Again, that's intercessory prayer. And then, you know, I already talked about this. You know, belief in a loving, compassionate God. That's where the health benefits come from. Belief in an angry, vengeful God is very stressful. You know, the idea that you might be struck down by a bolt of lightning for doing something inappropriate. That's kind of because we all do inappropriate stuff. You know, it's kind of stressful. And so this last point, the belief in sin as a guide to better living, rather than something that you're going to be punished for, is actually kind of goes back to the idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and we'll talk about this. So this is again from Catholicism. I apologize for using Catholic terminology or even Christian terminology, but every religion has something like this, some kind of ethical code, and all the ethical codes are pretty similar. They're not exact, but they're pretty similar. So I apologize, but I just wanted to kind of talk about this to say, you know, in terms of the way that sin, the word sin was originally meant, was that the reason that you avoid the sins is because you don't feel good when you do them. The reason that you do chastity and temperance, I don't even know what some of these things are, but chastity and temperance and charity and diligence, the reason that you do these things is because when you do them, you feel really good. It makes you a happier person. So the reason that you avoid sin is because it makes you feel guilty. It makes you it contributes to negative thoughts. So you want to try to keep with the virtuous activities as much as possible, just for your own sake, because you know the reason that you do it is because you want to feel good. You know, the reason that you eat healthy is because it makes you feel good immediately. You know, the reason why you exercise is because it makes you feel good. It improves your quality of life. And the reason why you do these things is because it's going to make you feel good. It's going to make you healthy. It's going to make you enjoy life more. So when we use, going back to intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, you know, think about how they use extrinsic motivation in religion. You know, if you do these bad things, you're going to go to hell. If you do these good things, then you're going to go to heaven. That's extrinsic motivation. Rather than intrinsic motivation, do these things because you're going to feel good, that you're going to enjoy it. So this is kind of what we do with my son, is try and motivate him intrinsically to do the right things, not necessarily because you're going to get a reward for it, but because it makes you feel good. You know, that's why you do it. It sounds a little sounds a little egotistical, I guess, or self-serving maybe, but you know that's what the happier you are, the more likely you're going to be to help other people. You know, so using extrinsic motivation to scare people into you know appropriate behavior, that's pretty common, and it's probably not the best way to motivate people, because we talked about that already. Okay, so I hope this was helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.